Every empire remembers its victories, but few remember the men who made them possible. Their endurance decided the fate of battles, yet history almost forgot their names. The victories of empire are easy to remember, but the men who made them possible often disappear into silence. The name of the Duke of Wellington still carries weight, order, and certainty. His battles are taught as examples of control in an age of chaos, of steady command in wars that reshaped Europe. Yet beneath those familiar victories lies a quieter story, one rarely spoken aloud. Armies do not move as ideas do. They move on tired legs, empty stomachs, and decisions made by men with little power over the world that claims their loyalty. In Wellington's campaigns, thousands of those men came from Ireland, drawn into imperial service by forces that offered few alternatives and even fewer promises. Ireland at the turn of the 19th century was not a land of calm opportunity. Economic pressure, land insecurity, and political tension shaped daily life in ways that left many young men facing narrow choices. Military service was not always a declaration of belief. Often, it was a calculation made in the absence of safer paths. The uniform offered food, structure, and wages, modest as they were, at a time when survival itself demanded compromise. For many Irish recruits, the army was less a symbol of empire and more a means to endure it. Once enlisted, these men entered a system that valued obedience above identity. Accents were noted, origins quietly recorded, and then gradually erased beneath regimental numbers and ranks. What mattered was reliability under pressure. Irish soldiers became known, sometimes begrudgingly, for endurance in difficult conditions. Long marches, limited supplies, and exposure to disease-tested armies before battles ever began. Those who could endure remained. Those who could not were replaced without ceremony. Wellington understood this reality with the calm clarity of a commander shaped by experience. His methods relied on discipline, cohesion, and the ability to hold ground under strain. Such qualities were not theoretical. They were human. When lines were expected to break, when positions were vulnerable, dependable regiments were placed where failure could not be afforded. Irish units were often among them, not because of sentiment, but because the system had learned to trust their resilience. Yet trust did not equal recognition. Victories were reported upward, attributed to leadership, planning, and national strength. The individual soldier rarely entered the record unless he rose far beyond expectation or fell in a way that demanded explanation. For most, service meant anonymity. Survival did not guarantee security, and courage did not ensure memory. What remained was the outcome, not the cost. For the listener, this story is not about accusation or praise. It is about balance. History tends to smooth its edges, leaving clean narratives where reality was uneven. By looking closely at those who stood beneath Wellington's command, a fuller understanding emerges. These men were not symbols. They were participants in decisions larger than themselves, carrying burdens that victory alone could not lift. Many listeners will recognize this pattern from other wars, where names fade while outcomes endure, and where ordinary service is absorbed into national myth. The calm telling of such stories allows space to consider responsibility without anger and loss without spectacle. This approach respects the listener's intelligence and offers a steadier rhythm, one that can be followed in quiet moments, late hours, or drifting attention without demand or strain. It invites reflection rather than reaction, encouraging understanding to settle gradually instead of arriving as shock or noise. In this way, the narrative remains open, patient, and deliberately unfinished until its full meaning can be felt rather than declared over time and quiet attention from the listener. What follows is not a tale of battles alone, but of the quiet weight carried by those history chose not to remember. Long before they faced enemy fire, many Irish soldiers were already fighting to survive their own circumstances. For young men in Ireland during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the decision to join the British Army rarely began with ideas of empire or loyalty. It began at home, in fields that no longer produced enough, in rents that rose without warning, and in families stretched thin by forces they could not influence. Political control rested elsewhere, and economic opportunity was uneven and fragile. In such conditions, military service appeared not as an honorable calling, but as a practical calculation made under pressure. The army promised regular meals, clothing, and a wage paid in coin rather than uncertainty. For many households, one son in uniform meant fewer mouths to feed and a small but reliable flow of income. This was not desperation in a dramatic sense, but a steady narrowing of options. When choices disappear quietly, decisions follow just as quietly. Enlistment papers were signed with little ceremony, often by men who expected nothing more than stability in return. Recruitment practices reflected this reality. Officers sent into Irish towns and countryside did not need to persuade through ideology. They offered certainty in exchange for service. The promise was simple and easily understood. Training, discipline, and danger would come later. What mattered first was that life inside the army seemed more predictable than life outside it. For listeners familiar with military history, this pattern is not unusual, but it gains weight when considered at scale. Irish recruits formed a substantial portion of the British Army, not because of enthusiasm, but because the structure of empire drew from the places where resistance was least practical. Once enlisted, Irish soldiers entered a system designed to suppress individuality. Regional identity was noted only when it affected discipline or cohesion. Over time, accents softened, habits were corrected, and loyalty was redirected toward regiment rather than homeland. This was not done with cruelty so much as efficiency. Armies function by reducing difference. In doing so, they create reliability, but they also erase origin. Training was strict, repetitive, and exhausting. It prepared soldiers not for glory, but for endurance. Long hours of drill-conditioned bodies and minds to respond without hesitation. Mistakes were corrected publicly. Success was rarely acknowledged. For Irish recruits, many of whom arrived with little formal structure in their previous lives, the army imposed order with relentless consistency. Some adapted quickly, others learned slowly. Those who could not adapt did not remain. The listener may notice that this environment left little room for reflection or protest. That absence is important. Irish soldiers did not debate the morality of campaigns they would later fight in Spain or elsewhere. They learned commands, formations, and survival. The army did not ask what they thought. It asked whether they could endure. Over time, endurance became expectation. This steady shaping of men into units explains why Irish regiments came to be seen as dependable. Not because of inherent traits, but because those who remained were those who could withstand the system. The process filtered out weakness and rewarded compliance. By the time these soldiers marched under Wellington's command, they had already passed through pressures that resembled a quieter form of battle. For an audience listening to relax or reflect, this story unfolds without urgency. It does not rush toward violence or victory. Instead, it builds understanding of how ordinary men became part of extraordinary events through gradual constraint rather than dramatic choice. It respects the listener's ability to hold complexity without resolution. The experience is meant to feel steady and absorbing, offering context that deepens attention rather than demanding it. In recognizing the conditions that shaped these soldiers, the listener is invited to consider how history often begins long before the moment it records, in lives shaped by forces too slow to notice until their consequences are fully revealed. Only after these men were shaped by necessity and discipline did they become the silent strength upon which victory would later depend. Before any battlefield tested them, the army tested whether these men could simply endure day after day without breaking. Life inside a British regiment followed a rhythm that rarely changed. Days began early, ended late, and were filled with repetition, designed to remove hesitation from thought and movement alike. Drill was not about elegance, but predictability. Each motion was rehearsed until it became instinctive, not because it inspired confidence, but because confusion under pressure was considered more dangerous than fear. For Irish soldiers, many of whom arrived with little exposure to rigid authority, this environment was both stabilizing and unforgiving. The army's training culture valued saneness. Personal history mattered only when it interfered with obedience. Voices were corrected, postures adjusted, and habits reshaped to fit a narrow standard. This process did not seek excellence in the modern sense, it sought reliability. A soldier did not need to think quickly or creatively. He needed to respond correctly, even when exhausted or frightened. Over time, this expectation filtered those who could not adapt from those who could. Marching revealed this most clearly. Campaigns demanded movement over long distances with limited rest, often through poor weather and uncertain terrain. Blisters, hunger, and illness weakened bodies before battle ever approached. Irish soldiers who remained in service learned how to pace themselves, how to conserve strength, and how to endure discomfort without complaint. These were not heroic lessons, but they were decisive ones. Armies collapse as often from fatigue as from enemy action. Within the regiment, trust developed slowly. Officers observed which units held formation, which men maintained discipline when tired, and which faltered under routine pressure. Irish regiments earned reputations not through dramatic acts, but through consistency. They arrived where ordered. They remained when required. In an institution that depended on predictability, this mattered deeply. Quiet reliability became its own form of value. Listeners may notice how little of this process involved recognition or reward. Training was not designed to build pride. It was designed to remove doubt. Soldiers learned to follow orders without asking why, because questioning delayed response. This approach suited Wellington's style of command. He favored control over improvisation, steady positioning over sudden movement. Such methods required troops who could be trusted to hold ground rather than seek glory. The effect of this preparation was subtle but lasting. By the time Irish soldiers reached the front lines of European campaigns, they had already been shaped into tools of endurance. Their strength lay not in moments of brilliance, but in their capacity to remain functional when conditions worsened. This quality would later place them at the most demanding points of battle, though that outcome was not yet apparent. For the audience, this section offers a quieter form of tension. There are no climactic events, only steady pressure and gradual transformation. It encourages the listener to settle into the rhythm of military life as these men experienced it, understanding how ordinary days accumulated into extraordinary readiness. The tone remains calm and deliberate, allowing the weight of routine to be felt rather than dramatized. This pacing supports long listening, rewarding patience with clarity. As attention drifts and returns, the central idea remains accessible. These soldiers were not hardened by sudden moments, but by prolonged exposure to discipline and fatigue. Their readiness was built slowly, almost invisibly. In recognizing this, the listener begins to sense how armies depend less on dramatic courage than on sustained endurance. This understanding prepares the ground for what comes next, when preparation meets reality and the cost of such endurance becomes unavoidable. When pressure finally arrived in its most demanding form, it would test not courage alone, but everything this quiet preparation had created. When the line trembled and failure seemed near, these men were often already there. Battle rarely unfolded as it appeared in later accounts. Plans were disrupted by weather, terrain, exhaustion, and the simple unpredictability of men under strain. Wellington understood this better than most. His method relied on holding ground, absorbing pressure, and resisting collapse until the moment came to respond. That approach demanded soldiers who could remain steady when momentum shifted against them. In many engagements, Irish regiments were placed where the risk of failure was highest, not by chance, but by expectation. Holding a line was not a dramatic act. It meant standing still while noise, confusion, and fear pressed inward. It required trust that others would do the same, even when vision narrowed and commands became harder to hear. Irish soldiers had already learned endurance through training and campaign life. In battle, that endurance translated into stillness when instinct urged movement. The decision not to move, not to break formation, often mattered more than any advance. These moments were rarely decisive on their own. They did not end battles quickly or produce instant victory. Instead, they prevented defeat. When a line held, Wellington gained time. Time to reposition, to reinforce, or to exploit enemy exhaustion. The contribution of those holding positions was therefore indirect, but essential. Without their resistance, opportunity never arrived. For the soldiers themselves, this role carried a particular burden. They were exposed to prolonged danger without the release of action. Standing under pressure demanded patience as much as courage. Casualties accumulated slowly, unpredictably. The absence of movement meant there was little sense of progress, only survival measured moment by moment. This kind of fighting left few stories suited to celebration, but it shaped outcomes all the same. Listeners may notice how this contrasts with popular images of warfare. The emphasis here is not on charges or heroic breakthroughs, but on restraint. Irish regiments were relied upon to absorb shock, to remain present when others might falter. This reliance was built on experience rather than sentiment. Wellington did not need admiration from his soldiers, he needed predictability. In that calculation, dependability outweighed distinction. Over time, patterns emerged. Units known for steadiness were placed in exposed positions again and again. Success reinforced expectation. Losses were accepted as part of the cost. The men who survived learned what their role was, even if it was never spoken aloud. They were there to hold, not to be remembered. For an audience listening quietly, this section invites a slower understanding of consequence. It avoids spectacle and allows attention to rest on decision and outcome rather than violence. The tone remains measured, acknowledging danger without amplifying it. This suits listeners who value reflection, offering insight without strain. As battles concluded and reports were written, the language of command smoothed these moments into tidy phrases. Lines held, positions were maintained. The human effort behind those words disappeared, yet without that effort, victories would have looked very different. Recognizing this does not diminish leadership or strategy, it completes them. In considering these moments, the listener is asked to think less about triumph and more about prevention, about the battles that were not lost because certain men endured longer than expected. This perspective deepens engagement without demanding emotion, allowing understanding to grow gradually. It is a quiet form of tension, sustained by awareness rather than excitement, and it carries the story forward without resolution. The question that remains is not how these victories were won, but what such silent endurance ultimately cost those who provided it. Victory was recorded in dispatches, but the men who secured it often returned to silence. When battles ended and armies moved on, recognition followed a familiar path. Commanders were praised, strategies examined, and outcomes absorbed into national memory. For ordinary soldiers, especially those from Irish regiments, the aftermath was quieter. Survival itself became the measure of success. There were no ceremonies for holding a line, no formal acknowledgement for enduring where retreat would have been understandable. The system moved forward, and individuals were expected to move with it. Pay remained modest and advancement rare. Promotion depended not only on service, but on patronage, literacy, and opportunity, all unevenly distributed. Many Irish soldiers lacked the connections or education that eased progress within the ranks. Their reliability was valued, but it did not translate easily into status. Dependable men were often left where they were most useful. In this way, consistency became a trap rather than a reward. As campaigns continued, losses accumulated. Units replenished their numbers with new recruits who stepped into roles shaped by those who had come before. The regiment persisted even as individuals disappeared from its memory. Names were replaced, faces forgotten, and stories condensed into statistics. This process was not deliberately cruel, it was simply efficient. Armies, like empires, function by abstraction. For listeners familiar with long military histories, this pattern may feel recognizable. Service without recognition is common, particularly among those drawn from the margins of power. The Irish soldier's experience reflects a broader truth about institutions that rely on sacrifice while limiting visibility. What distinguishes this case is scale. Irishmen were present in large numbers, yet rarely acknowledged as a distinct contribution once the war ended. Returning home did not resolve this imbalance. Veterans carried injuries, habits, and memories shaped by years of discipline and danger. Civilian life often offered little support for reintegration. Pensions were limited and inconsistently applied. Many former soldiers migrated, seeking work elsewhere within the empire or beyond it. Their service became a personal history rather than a public one, known within families, but absent from national narratives. This quiet disappearance from record reinforces the title's central tension. Victories endure because they serve identity and pride. The men who made them possible complicate those stories, introducing ambiguity and cost. As a result, they fade, not erased, but set aside. Over time, absence becomes normal. The tone here remains restrained, allowing the listener to absorb consequence without anger or accusation. This approach suits an audience that values clarity over confrontation. By presenting outcomes rather than judgments, the narrative invites reflection rather than reaction. It respects the listener's ability to draw meaning gradually without being directed toward a single conclusion. There is also comfort in this pacing. For those listening late at night or in quiet moments, the story unfolds without demand. It acknowledges loss without amplifying it, and injustice without dramatizing it. This balance helps sustain attention over long durations, offering substance without fatigue. What emerges is an understanding that victory did not belong equally to all who served it. Some carried its weight forward into recognition and legacy. Others carried it home in silence. The difference was shaped not by courage or effort, but by position within a system designed to remember outcomes, not contributors. As this awareness settles, the story deepens. The listener begins to sense that what has been described so far is only part of a larger structure, one shaped by command decisions as much as by social conditions. The quiet absence of recognition raises questions about responsibility and dependence that cannot yet be fully answered. Those questions remain, steady and unresolved, drawing the narrative forward without urgency. To understand why this imbalance endured, it becomes necessary to look upward, toward the command that relied so heavily on what it rarely named. Wellington's victories depended not on chance, but on careful calculation, and on men whose contributions were often invisible. Command decisions are rarely made in the moment of battle alone. Wellington's correspondence, orders, and preparations reveal a mind attuned to the smallest variables that could tip a campaign. Terrain, weather, supply lines, and morale were all considered alongside the movements of units whose identities were noted in reports but rarely acknowledged beyond their function. Irish regiments were trusted for steadiness, for the capacity to hold when others might falter, yet their presence remained almost entirely functional in the eyes of official record. The Duke understood that reliance on dependable soldiers created both opportunity and risk. By placing units where pressure would be greatest, he could influence outcomes indirectly, shaping the battlefield without overextending command. These decisions were not morally neutral, but they were practical. Lives were calculated in terms of effect on the line, survival as a tool rather than a priority. For Irish troops, this meant repeated exposure to positions where failure was expected to be costly. Their endurance was assumed, not celebrated. Wellington's approach also reflected a broader philosophy of command, predictability over improvisation. He needed regiments that could execute orders reliably, regardless of conditions. Irish soldiers, already conditioned by rigorous training and long campaigns, fit that model. Their discipline allowed him to concentrate effort elsewhere, confident that positions would hold. Such reliance was strategic rather than sentimental, a quiet form of power exercised through trust in endurance. The human dimension of these decisions is subtle yet significant. Officers assessed performance, endurance, and cohesion, often in ways that did not leave names in the record. The choice to deploy certain men in the most exposed sectors was simultaneously recognition of ability and a tacit acknowledgement of expendability. Calculated risk was the currency of command, and Irish regiments often bore it with unrecorded patience. Listeners can appreciate how this dynamic shaped the war beyond any single engagement. Decisions at the top filtered down into consequences for individuals, yet those consequences were rarely personal in the historical narrative. The men were necessary without being named, effective without being honored. Their role was embedded in outcome, inseparable from victory, yet largely invisible to the historical memory that codified success. This understanding reframes traditional accounts of Wellington's campaigns. Success was not only about leadership or strategy in abstraction. It depended on human reliability under predictable and unpredictable stress. Irish soldiers were central to this calculus, yet the narrative that survives emphasizes results over participants. The subtle tension between dependence and anonymity defines the experience of the regiments involved, offering insight into how empires achieve objectives quietly, through systems rather than spectacle. For the audience, this section emphasizes reflection over drama. The story advances through comprehension of decision-making, not through sensational events. Listeners are encouraged to consider the mechanics of command and the quiet weight of responsibility carried by those who are counted upon but rarely counted in reports. This approach sustains attention by engaging reasoning and empathy simultaneously, appealing to patience and measured understanding. The narrative here is deliberately calm, avoiding exaggeration or making the stakes clear. It highlights the consequences of command choices without moralizing. The listener senses both the strategic logic and the personal cost, appreciating the subtlety of reliance that underpins historical success. The rhythm of the storytelling mirrors the discipline of the soldiers themselves, steady, precise, and understated. By considering Wellington's dependence, the listener is invited to recognize that history's visible victories are inseparable from hidden labor. Strategy and endurance intersect, producing outcomes remembered, while those who ensured them fade from memory. This reflection naturally prepares the mind for the next stage of understanding, as the story turns to what happened once the battle ceased and history began to choose what to remember. When the guns finally fell silent, the consequences of years of service became clear in ways far removed from glory or recognition. For the Irish soldiers who had endured campaigns under Wellington's command, the end of hostilities did not bring celebration. The army moved on to new postings, nations returned to peace, and official accounts recorded outcomes, not the individuals who made them possible. Pensions, if awarded, were limited, delayed, and inconsistently administered. Many veterans returned to homes still marked by poverty and uncertainty, carrying injuries, habits, and memories that were invisible to those who recorded victories in dispatches. The quiet persistence of service contrasted sharply with the lack of acknowledgement, leaving men whose contributions were indispensable largely unrecognized. Migration often followed. Some sought employment within Britain, others across colonial holdings, hoping that experience and reliability would translate into opportunity. For many, the promise of stability remained elusive. Families who relied on the income from enlistment had gained little long-term security, and communities rarely recorded their service beyond anecdotal memory. These men became footnotes in their own lives, remembered locally but absent from broader narratives. The slow drift from recognition was both practical and structural, reflecting how empires catalogued outcome rather than effort. The emotional consequence of this absence was subtle yet profound. Soldiers who had endured extreme pressure and repeated danger did not experience the public validation of their service. Their endurance, once the foundation of victories, became invisible in the historical record. Yet those same qualities, discipline, patience, and reliability, remained embedded in the institutions they had served. The tension between contribution and memory defined their post-war existence, and it shaped how later generations would perceive the campaigns. Listeners familiar with military history may recognize this as a pattern repeated across conflicts, but its impact is heightened here by the scale and concentration of Irish service. Their numbers were significant and their roles strategically essential. Yet the system's focus on outcomes over individuals ensured that survival did not translate into acknowledgement, and courage did not guarantee remembrance. By examining these consequences calmly and methodically, the story emphasizes consequence without dramatization, inviting reflection on what it means to serve faithfully in obscurity. Reintegration into civilian life was uneven. Skills gained in the army did not always transfer smoothly to peacetime labor. Physical injuries, emotional fatigue, and habits formed under command complicated adjustment. Veterans navigated social and economic landscapes that had not accounted for their experience. These challenges were amplified by a historical record that valued victories over personal stories. The result was an extended period in which the contributions of these men were hidden by the very success they had helped secure. The listener is encouraged to consider the long-term effects of service without recognition. This is not intended to provoke indignation, but to cultivate awareness of patterns that shape historical memory. Quiet reflection on these outcomes deepens understanding of how empires function, how command decisions ripple through lives, and how human endurance sustains systems even when it remains unnoticed. It allows for a measured emotional engagement, promoting comprehension rather than reaction. By observing the contrast between battlefield necessity and post-war neglect, the narrative gently exposes the imbalance between recorded history and lived experience. The Irish soldier's role remains central, not as a footnote, but as a lens through which the listener understands the costs of strategic dependence. Their persistence, disciplined yet unacknowledged, defines the moral and practical texture of Wellington's campaigns, offering insight into the hidden dimensions of military success. The calm, deliberate pacing ensures that attention remains steady. The story unfolds in layers, allowing the audience to grasp consequence gradually. It respects the listener's intelligence, encouraging sustained engagement while remaining soothing enough for background or late-night listening. Reflection is invited without demand, comprehension grows without pressure, and the quiet weight of memory lingers. What history chooses to remember often omits the very people whose endurance made its victories possible. History records the outcome, but the men who shaped it are rarely seen in the story itself. As the campaigns concluded and peace settled over Europe, the selective memory of war became apparent. Wellington's victories were celebrated, maps were redrawn, and nations marked the triumphs as milestones of strategy and leadership. Yet those who carried the weight of action, the soldiers whose endurance and steadfastness had made success possible, remained largely absent from these accounts. Their presence persisted only in subtle traces, regimental lists, pension rolls, or passing mention in correspondence. The narrative of glory overshadowed the reality of human labor, leaving many Irish soldiers invisible in history's formal record. The choice of what to remember is rarely deliberate in a conscious moral sense. It emerges from the structures that prioritize certain voices over others. Commanders, chroniclers, and governments record victories as symbols of state power, effectiveness, and narrative cohesion. Ordinary participants are absorbed into abstraction, acknowledged as necessary only insofar as their actions contributed to observable outcomes. This framework explains why generations could celebrate Wellington, while the men who formed the backbone of his army became peripheral in memory. For the listener, understanding this distinction reframes familiar stories. The focus shifts from the spectacle of campaigns to the human dimensions that support them: endurance, discipline, and the quiet acceptance of risk. It emphasizes that historical achievement is built not solely on brilliance, but on the persistence of those whose names are seldom recorded. Irish soldiers exemplified this dynamic, capable, reliable, and often placed where the stakes were highest, yet rarely attributed with individual recognition. Their influence was structural, embedded in the army's capacity to function under pressure rather than in visible moments of heroism. The pattern extends beyond the battlefield. Post-war lives of these men often reflected the same dynamics of service and anonymity. Reintegration into civilian society offered challenges similar to those experienced during enlistment, limited options, social displacement, and the endurance of hardship. Pensions and formal recognition were inconsistent. Their contributions, while foundational to imperial success, were mediated through systems that valued outcomes more than human experience. Listeners attuned to the rhythms of these stories perceive a continuity between wartime necessity and peacetime obscurity. This reflection also carries a subtle lesson about the nature of history itself. What is celebrated is rarely comprehensive. What endures is often chosen for clarity rather than completeness. Irish soldiers remind us that systems of power rely on human reliability, sometimes in ways that escape attention. By examining the interface between recorded success and unrecorded service, the audience is encouraged to consider both the mechanics of command and the quiet forms of courage that sustain them. Understanding arises gradually, without sensationalism, in a calm unfolding that mirrors the deliberate nature of these men's contribution. Listeners are invited to dwell in this perspective, to appreciate victories not solely as abstract achievements, but as outcomes dependent upon invisible endurance. The experience is immersive and measured, promoting reflection rather than reaction. In this quiet space, The weight of history can be understood in human terms, and attention is guided gently toward comprehension without demand. It provides insight into the intersection of strategy, reliance, and memory. By the end of this reflection, the narrative is complete, tracing the arc from enlistment through endurance, deployment, and finally, the post-war erasure of recognition. The story closes without dramatic flourish, allowing the listener to carry away an awareness of the structural and personal dimensions of historical achievement. Calm understanding replaces spectacle, and the quiet significance of these forgotten soldiers remains present in thought long after the narration ceases. The ultimate lesson is clear. While Wellington's victories endure in record and memory, they rest on the steadfast labor of men whose names history largely omitted and whose presence shaped outcomes in ways that remain essential, if silent.